I remained faithful for years. And yet, I just kept asking myself, was it all a hoax? That was Meri Brown, finally speaking up after 10 years of suffering, heartbreak, and sniping behind doors. For viewers of Sister Wives, those words are as big a shock as a lightning bolt. How could someone who seemed so sturdy, so long-suffering, feel so invisible, so betrayed? Her relationship with Kody Brown was showcased on TV as a complicated but working polygamous family. Behind the cameras, however, it was a roller coaster of broken trust, hidden tensions, and moments that no one at home could ever possibly imagine. And if you thought that was shocking, wait until you see what came next. From lonely nights in a house full of people, to whispers of fights that never made it to air, Meri's journey was a constant push and pull between love, loyalty, and self-preservation. Fans who watched her for years always sensed there was more beneath the surface. And now, for the first time, Meri is telling her story, her way. Meri Brown's story doesn't start with drama. It starts with hope. She entered the life of Kody with visions of a family, trusting in love, faith, and hope for being together. Early on, everything was normal, almost picture perfect. They laughed over breakfast, made hushed promises about the future, and in those early still times, it was simple to believe that love and loyalty would endure forever. But behind the scenes, currents were changing, subtle and unperceived. To live in a polygamous home is not to live in a normal family. Every choice is exaggerated. Every offhand remark can be a tempest. Meri, while smiling on film, too often bore a load no one could discern. She had to balance her position as one wife among multiple against the demands of others. And yet, she remained. Year after year, she remained. Some said it was devotion. Others made it a hushed-up secret. Behind the closed doors, the problems stacked up in quiet, out-of-the-way ways. There were moments when Kody's focus appeared to be for other people, and Meri's comments were not heard. She recalls sitting in the kitchen by herself, a cup of tea cooling in her hands, repeating the same question again and again. Am I enough? Am I being seen? It was not a dramatic moment. No shout, no cameras snapping, just a slow, creeping pain that eroded her confidence and sense of self. But in spite of it all, she attempted it. She went to family gatherings, beamed for holiday pictures, and uttered the correct phrases at the correct times. She walked the tightrope of her public image, aware that any misstep could be highlighted for audiences to critique. And the irony was devastating. The very same individuals celebrating her determination would never be able to comprehend the hidden battles that filled her days and evenings. Despite all her efforts, cracks started appearing. Minor squabbles escalated into drawn-out silences, misunderstandings froze into icy walls, and the emotional chasm between Meri and Kody widened further. She started journaling her emotions, not for anyone else's reading eyes, but for her own, a diary of thoughts, irritation, and small triumphs that no one else would ever see. She invested herself in her own introspection, searching for sanity in a world that all too often seemed disorderly, mercurial, and isolating. And yet, through every tear, every late-night doubt, every quiet betrayal that no one else could see, Meri's spirit endured. She carried on, waiting for the day she could speak her truth, knowing it might shock the world. And in that silence, everything changed. It was during those long, quiet evenings that Meri began noticing patterns she could no longer ignore. They were sincere at first. A look, a broken promise, a hushed conversation she wasn't privy to. But slowly the small signs mounted, creating a portrait she could no longer deny. Kody, the man she had opened her heart to, had layers she didn't get to experience fully. Layers that, in retrospect, showed her a widening distance she couldn't bridge or pretend not to notice. Meri recalls a night clearly. The house dark, the children in bed, and she sitting on her bed looking up at the ceiling. The pressure of the unspoken words weighed upon her, a burden she had been carrying for years but had tried to brush aside. Was I blind? She asked herself. Or did I just hope too hard that things would be different? That evening, she understood that loyalty had been paid for dearly, her own voice, her own wishes, and possibly her own happiness. Life in a polygamous marriage, she says today, is not merely the sharing of a husband, it is the living of a tangled web of expectation, emotion, and unwritten rules that an outsider cannot possibly begin to comprehend. She had learned to smile when the heart did not cooperate, to laugh when the heart hurt, to nod when agreement was withheld. And yet, even while she danced this delicate ballet of pretenses, the truth within her flamed more fiercely each passing day. There were occasions of passing pleasure, of course, family gatherings, earnest talks with her children, even occasional belly laughter with Kody. But these moments were interspersed with stabs of loneliness that no TV camera could depict. She remembers sitting silently at the kitchen table, appearing to read while in her mind, replaying the pain she could not speak out loud. The paradoxes were infuriating. A life filled with people, but a heart often lonely. And if you believe that's shocking, wait until you hear what occurred next. Because it was not only the distance that bothered her, it was the secrets, the concealed choices, the sly betrayals that nibbled at the edges of the foundation of trust she had accumulated over the years. Every disclosure, no matter how minute, was like a crack spreading in her painstakingly preserved world. It all the while, Meri held on to one thing. Hope that her voice would be heard someday. Hope that she might retrieve the pieces of herself that had been silenced. Hope that what viewers merely caught on their screens was only half a much greater, much more complex truth. And in that still, contemplative place, she made a decision, not yet spoken aloud, not yet acted upon, but a choice that would change everything. Meri's decision didn't arrive with a dramatic announcement. It was quieter than that, subtle, almost imperceptible, but it carried the weight of years spent trying to balance love and self-preservation. She began observing more, listening closer, noticing the ways Kody's attention shifted, the moments that were left unshared, and the patterns she had long denied. Every observation was like a small spark, lighting up areas of her life that she had kept in the dark. She remembers one day when she laughed at a memory she hadn't shared with anyone else. It was something small, but the thought struck her like a shock. She had been living pieces of herself, pieces that nobody, not even Kody, really knew. And in that momentary awareness, the reality became inevitable. Her life with him was a combination of loyalty and loneliness, devotion and doubt, love and loss. The moment of transition wasn't a dramatic argument or epiphany. It was a series of subliminal betrayals, built up over a decade. Invitations extended without her presence, choices made without her opinion, and the constant gnawing sense of being second to other people's desires. In the beginning, she attempted rationalization, she forgave, tried to persuade herself that her persistence would one day be rewarded. But gradually the rationalizations crumbled under the force of reality. Meri's reflection was not just about what was happening between her and Kody. It was about what it meant for her own identity. Who was she when her voice was constantly muted? Who could she become if she finally stopped bending to fit the contours of a life that no longer felt like hers? It was frightening to even think about leaving the part she had played so flawlessly for so many years. And yet there was an ember, a small nagging voice, that spoke, "You deserve better. You deserve to be noticed." Even amidst these awakenings, the family was still at the center of her life. The children, the memories shared, the delicate strands of attachment, these made everything complicated. To leave or to face these habits wasn't all about personal choice. It was entwined with the lives of all the people she loved. The struggle of wanting to guard her heart, yet keeping up the appearance of the family, created an emotional push and pull she couldn't escape or even articulate. And if you thought this was the breaking point, the most intense moment was still ahead. Because the real test wasn't so much seeing the cracks, it was choosing what to do about them. How do you take back your life when the world knows only the one you've shown them? How do you face a love that's been both nourishing and crushing for 10+ years? In that still, contemplative moment, Meri knew that change was inevitable. And when it came, it would rock all she had ever known. The walls of the Brown family had experienced it all: laughter and celebrations, quiet mornings, and unspoken tension. But nothing had prepared Meri for the burden of the truths she was starting to face. With time, the illusion of harmony that television viewers experienced on screen had become nearly intolerable behind closed doors. Every smile she gave to the world weighed more than the previous one, like she was bearing the combined burden of a decade's worth of silences, betrayals, and compromises. Meri remembers nights when Kody's attention seemed to be elsewhere, when talks she believed were shared moments turned out to be instances she had been left behind. Those little omissions, at first brushed off as irrelevant, came to seem like invisible cuts, soft but unremitting, reshaping her sense of self, her marriage, and the life she had fought so hard to maintain. And yet, on the surface, everything seemed normal. She became adept at acting as if the fissures didn't matter, even as they crept stealthily beneath the surface. There were times that felt nearly cruelly ironic. Family gatherings when laughter echoed through the rooms. But she felt an emptiness inside that no one could detect. Her children filled her with joy, but even they made her remember all that she had lost in order to remain. And when she sat by herself in her bedroom, the silence weighed heavy, like a physical thing, insisting that she confront what she had been keeping at bay for so many years. It wasn't so much the distance between her and Kody that plagued her. It was the levels of secrecy and selective truths that turned every interaction into a war of endurance. She recalls feeling like she was second-guessing herself. Had she been wrong all along? Was she seeing edges of betrayal where none existed? Or had she been instinctively correct all along, silently conveying the truths she was afraid to acknowledge? And if you believe that tension was too much to bear, what followed would drive her to the brink. It wasn't a televised shouting match or an on-camera confrontation. It was the aggregation of every microscopic exclusion, every ignored complaint, every moment that her allegiance was not noted. Each moment eroded the pillars she had constructed, until she could no longer deny the irrefutable change had to come. But even as the awareness came, she wrestled with fear and doubt. How did she get her voice back in a life that had conditioned her to silence it? How could she untangle the love, duty, and obligation that bound her to a family she loved but felt imprisoned by? The questions hung there, unasked, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath, expecting the answer she still hadn't discovered. And in that frozen instant, Meri realized the truth she had so long suppressed. The life she'd known was changing. And nothing, no camera, no anticipation, no thoughtfully fabricated image could halt it. Meri's world began to feel smaller even as the house seemed fuller than ever. Crowded rooms, endless responsibilities, and a public life under constant scrutiny all clashed with the private truths she could no longer ignore. Every carefully rehearsed smile, every nod to the cameras, every polite agreement felt like a performance, and the weight of pretending became almost unbearable. She came to understand that she was leading double lives, a one for the cameras, a one for herself, and the chasm between them grew wider every day. It was on one of those secluded, lonely nights that the reality sunk in. On the side of her bed, she sat, journal open, and she started listing all the instances that had cut into her trust stealthily. The quiet partiality she had been condoning for so long. The choices that were made behind her back, which at first had appeared small but over time had shown a pattern. The hushed words behind the doors where she had been left outside. Every memory was a tiny fissure, and collectively they had created a split that no smile could conceal. She started to identify with her own responses in the moment, the empty laughter, the skirting around real conversation, the manner in which she would enter a room and immediately feel invisible. It wasn't merely emotional hurt, it was one of physical pain, an inner pull that reminded her every day of her own invisibility. But she couldn't abandon the family she loved. How could she balance her own requirements with the life she had committed to? And then there were the rumors she had suspected all along and dreaded being forced to face. Secrets that had lain in plain sight, disguised in gestures, in choices, in the soft redirections of focus she had disbelieved or excused away. They weren't salacious in the Daily Mail way, but to her they were earthquake-sized. They showed her a trend that questioned everything: the decisions Kody had made, the priorities he had established, and the nature of a relationship she had idealized for so long. And if you think the treachery stops there, it doesn't. Because the hardest truth wasn't so much the actions themselves. It was understanding how long she'd been blind to them, how long she'd excused them in the name of love and loyalty. That truth knocked the breath out of her, slammed her back into her chair, leaving her reeling, unsure and afraid of what it meant for the rest of her life. Meri spent hours thinking, sometimes openly crying, sometimes struggling to laugh, just to be normal. Every second was a balance with her own heart, the wish to remain, the urge to talk, and the encroaching sense that life in her world would never be the same. And within the silence she knew the choices she made next would resonate throughout her whole world. And nothing, not even fear, was able to hold back the inevitable reckoning. Meri understood that the life she had held onto for so long was based on a delicate balance. Take one step in the wrong direction, utter one unspoken truth, and it would all come crashing down around her. The quiet night she once enjoyed now seemed oppressive, filled with questions that had no easy answer. Every step she made felt calculated, measured, but the weight of what had happened over the years squeezed down a little harder each day. She recalls one afternoon, when she strolled through the familiar spaces of the house, and observed things she had never noticed before. The frayed edge of a chair where she sat by herself during stressful family meals, the dimmish sound of laughter in hallways, where she felt ignored, the way Kody's eyes would scan past her in moments that should have been hers. These were little things, barely noticeable, but each bore the mark of neglect, quiet but incontrovertible. Even the children, her hold on stability, were a reflection of her internal conflict. She wanted to keep them safe, to cover for them from upset, but she also wanted them to bear witness to her truth. How could she explain the fissures in a world they had always been led to believe was flawless? The compromise between upholding peace and upholding her own reality became increasingly untenable. And there were the moments of introspection, which hit with shocking clarity. Sitting alone in her bed, she would go through the memories that had accumulated over 10 years. The unspoken sacrifices, the compromises, the tearful nights in silence. It wasn't the blatant betrayals that stung, it was the intangible accumulation of being unseen, unheard, and at times undervalued. Every memory was a bitter reminder that loyalty without recognition costs, and she had paid the price in full. And if you believe the tale ends here, the ensuing revelation would upend it all. Because it wasn't just a matter of her relationship with Kody, it was a matter of the system she belonged to. The household rules, the expectations placed on her, the societal pressures, and the perpetual seesaw between individual happiness and family obligation had created a tempest that she was no longer able to ride in silence. But even amidst this chaos, there were small flashes of strength. A soft smile from a child, a brief moment of bonding with a friend, the knowledge that her own voice, silenced for so long, could still be heard. These reminders told her that in spite of the betrayals, the ostracisms and the isolation, she was not powerless. She could choose how to navigate the next chapter, and for the first time in years, that possibility felt exhilarating and terrifying. In that quiet tension, she understood something crucial. The coming confrontation, the coming revelations, would not just change her life. They would challenge everything the world thought it knew about her, Kody, and the family she had devoted herself to. Meri's reflection turned into a reckoning. She had danced around the unspoken realities, the subtle deceptions, and the silent tensions that had characterized her marriage for years. But now, with each recollection and every flash of perception, what she had suffered became inescapable. She could no longer avoid the pattern that had been in effect for more than a decade. A pattern that had subtly determined her self-concept, her decisions, and her emotional landscape. It was one night, in the poor light of her living room, that it hit her most acutely. Kody, as usual, was lost in his own universe. While she was seated with a twist of frustration, fear, and wistfulness clenched tightly within her, she observed the silhouettes on the walls. Silhouettes that appeared to mirror the unseen tension she had borne all these years. And in the silence, she saw that what she had endured in loyalty and love had turned into a cage, one in which she could no longer remain. The intricacy of a plural marriage wasn't such that there was an easy option. Each decision she weighed was knotted up with responsibilities, family pressure, and the lives of the children whom she cherished. It wasn't so much a case of leaving as it was a ripple that would impact the whole foundation upon which she had taken years to build. And yet, to remain was to perpetuate an act of pretending that sucked the life out of her slowly, bit by bit. She started seeing the little human things that had long gone unseen. The hesitation in Kody's voice when speaking of certain things, the way he'd sidle around her worries, the manner in which moments of closeness felt fleeting and calculated. Each thing, compiled together, spoke a tale she'd always known but was too terrified to entirely confront. And it was a tale that cried out for an answer. And if you suppose this is all about anger, there was something deeper. The silent sorrow of knowing how much of herself she had sacrificed. The hours, the patience, the absolute devotion, all for the sake of hoping her sacrifice would be valued. Her voice understood, her existence respected. But year after year, that recognition never quite materialized. The sorrow wasn't thunderous, it was low grade. A constant hum that no grin could conceal. It was in the quietness of that evening that Meri made a decision, not a vociferous announcement, not a sensational showdown, but a private vow to herself, a vow to respect her own emotions, to guard her sense of self, and to confront the realities she had been avoiding for so long. That decision was a turning point. A point where hope, fear, and bravery met. And in the crash, she realized something disturbing and profound. The world she had assumed was hers was half a tale, and the revelations to come would surprise even those who had been following her story for years. Thought the following days were filled with implicit tension. Meri walked through the home with an old new sense of awareness, seeing everything she had long taken for granted. The manner in which conversations changed when she walked into a room. The unobtrusive ways in which her opinions were rejected. The unspoken hierarchy that governed every encounter. What had once been routine now exposed itself as a web she had wandered in for years without ever fully comprehending its rules. She recalls one afternoon standing in the kitchen, her hands wrapped around a warm cup of coffee, watching the sunlight fall across the countertops. A smile played across her lips, but it was tinged with sadness. In the still moment, she saw how much of herself had been put off, how much energy had gone toward upholding a tenuous peace, and how long she had not seen the fissures opening beneath her feet. All her attempts, all her concessions, all her soft-spoken apologies now towered in her mind. The realization was jarring. Her patience, her loyalty, her steadfast commitment had been both cage and shield, and the cage had tightened around her over time, nourished by years of silence and foregone possibilities. The love she had freely bestowed was complicated by a lack of reciprocation, by instances in which her needs went unnoticed, and by choices made without consulting her. Every instant, slight in and of itself, added up to a reality she could no longer ignore. And if you believe this was the turning point, then it was only just the start. For the more she thought about it, the more it became apparent that the tale spectators had watched on television was merely part of a fragment. Under the carefully planned smiles and the opened arms of pretend families, there was a truth much more intricate, much more passionate, and much more human than anybody could have even begun to dream of. The truth was encased in little betrayals, in silent omissions, and in decisions that had gone quietly about transforming the course of her life. Meri started keeping all her thoughts more seriously, not for others, not for approval, but for herself. Every entry was a reflection, showing her strength, her anguish, and her increasing awareness that the life she had embraced no longer worked for her. It was in those secret hours that she started questioning herself as she had avoided doing so in all these years. How much more of this double life could she keep up? How much of herself was she going to give up before taking back her voice? Even amidst fear, there was a certain irrepressible glimmer of determination. She felt a sense of control she had never seen before. For the first time in years, the future held challenges, heartbreak, and confrontation, but freedom, truth, and self-respect as well. And in that still, frozen moment, Meri came to understand something fundamental. The chapters that lay ahead for her would not only redefine her life, they would redefine how the world perceived her, Kody, and the family she had long considered home. The succeeding days were filled with an almost intolerable tension. Meri navigated the household with an acute sensitivity, observing every movement, every look, every word that was guardedly chosen. The patterns she had long known were no longer subtle but unmistakable. Every interaction brought back the wondrous balancing act that she had done for more than a decade. And with every reminder, the burden of her silence was even greater. She recalls one night, standing in the living room window, as the sun set below the horizon. The sky was ablaze with color, a violent contrast to the storm raging silently within her. At that moment, she considered the years she had devoted to a marriage that had preserved her and ignored her. The painful, surreal dichotomy. She had given herself to a family she loved at the cost of gradually losing sight of the woman she was before loyalty was her currency. The tiny betrayals, the exclusions, and the constant sense of invisibility had built on each other into a power she could no longer discount. And if you believe that was the worst, the most shocking discoveries were yet to come. For in the moment she had known for years, there were not only secrets and decisions she had never fully been privy to, but also choices that altered her comprehension of the life she had strived to maintain. There was anger, heartbreak, and the understanding that nothing would ever be the same with each discovery. Even the everyday rhythms of home were changed. Discussions that had previously been everyday now had secret meaning. Smiles warm on the surface were bordered with evasiveness. Decisions taken in her absence now exposed underlying control and preference she had long forgiven for the sake of allegiance. The stark difference between the life she had embraced and the life she began to perceive struck her sense of self, and she struggled with feelings both strong and overwhelming. And during those still moments, Meri faced herself with questions she had skirted all these years. How much of my life have I lost without knowing it? How many years did I keep my voice silenced in the very spot where I ought to have been heard the loudest? And most terrifyingly, what will it cost me to regain my sense of self? Her introspections did not come easily or comfortably. They bore the burden of remorse, the stinging pain of betrayal, and the uncertainty of what lay ahead. And yet, in it all there was a stillness building. A resolve to confront the truths she had evaded for so long and to move forward on the path before her with strength, integrity, and an unshakable commitment to herself. At that moment of contemplation, she understood one thing with utter certainty: the family she had given her heart to, the life she had created, and the love she had shared would never be viewed the same way again. The years of tension had culminated into a state where it could no longer be kept under wraps. Meri started seeing the patterns more acutely, the subtle choices, the implicit priorities, and the times her presence was taken for granted. It wasn't one defining moment that pushed her awareness. It was the buildup of years of juggling her own needs against the needs of a household that had so much to claim. She recalls a night when she was by herself in her bedroom, the quiet hum of the house about her, the faraway laughter of children like a bittersweet echo. In the quiet, she thought about the decisions she had made, the compromises she had taken, and the silent cost that they had paid in eroding her sense of self. Each year of fidelity, each attempt at maintaining peace, and each bottled frustration crystallized into a silent realization: she could not continue living in shards of herself. The insidious deceits to which she had been subjected were no longer theoretical. They were seared into her mind, enlarged by the acuity of self-awareness. Invites she had been excluded from, hushed-up conclusions she did not hear, and the persistent turning of faces to others created a picture that she could no longer ignore. And if you believe the tale stops there, the emotional reality that ensued would be even more disturbing. For the test had not been merely accepting these facts. It was in making a choice about how to react without destroying the family she adored, yet regaining the respect and recognition she had so long been denied. Even mundane moments were heavy with meaning. A glance in the hall, a passing remark, or the way Kody would refuse eye contact when speaking during crucial talks said it all. Every movement reinforced the emotional distance built up in secret over the years, the gap between loyalty and awareness that had widened irreparably. And as reality dawned, Meri understood that maintaining this thin thread of balance demanded strength she hadn't yet summoned until this moment. It was in these introspective moments that she also came face to face with questions that had hung too long. How long had she kept herself on the sidelines? How much of her voice had she lost in the pursuit of peace? And most critically, what kind of life could she craft if she finally took action on the truths she had discovered? And in the quiet of that evening, the solution started to clarify, less as a concrete resolution, more as a glimmer of agency and possibility. She realized change would be inevitable, would hurt, and would upset everything the world believed about her. And yet, even amidst fear and uncertainty, a quiet resolve emerged: the life she had been living could no longer define her. It was time to reclaim her story. The tension in Mary's world reached a crescendo she could no longer ignore. Each day felt heavier, each conversation more loaded, as if the walls themselves were holding the secrets she had long tried to navigate. The carefully constructed life she had built for family and public consumption was beginning to crack under the pressure of truths that would not be kept concealed. She remembers a late night when she had been walking alone through the still house, the faint buzz of appliances and the occasional groan of floorboards providing the only sounds in the silence. It was there she realized the full burden of what she had been through, the years of devotion, the sacrifices, the little betrayals she had written off as meaningless. And all at once, it could no longer be denied. The world she had known was only a part of reality, and she had been moving in the shadows for far too long. The quiet exclusions, the missed opinions, the perpetual balancing act of pleasing and being invisible, it had all coalesced into a power she could no longer deny. And if you think that epiphany was the finale, it was merely the start, because these moments of awareness came with a tide of questions, confrontations, and emotional reckonings that she would be compelled to deal with sooner rather than later. Even minute details became impossible to ignore. A passing glance, an interrupted conversation, the inflection of a careless remark, they all showed fissures in the foundation on which she had come to depend for so long. Every detail compelled her to face an unpleasant reality. Love by itself was not sufficient to shore up her sense of self when appreciation and esteem were denied her. The very home that had once been comfortable as home suddenly felt like a stage, and she had been playing a role no longer hers. Alone in her thoughts, she started to realize the strength of her own resilience. All the secret tears she'd cried, all the late nights of anger and frustration, every moment of doubt that had made her question her decisions, had built a resolve which could no longer be overlooked. She knew that taking back her voice would be dirty, hurtful, and unpredictable, but it had to be. And within that heavy, stifling tension, Meri understood a deep truth: the tale people had witnessed was but the facade. Underneath the smiles and the family portraits, and the TV cable appeal drama, was a path marked by strength, resilience, and a dogged pursuit of self. She no longer wanted the story of her life to be written in silence or in expectation. In that moment, she made a choice, quiet, deliberate, and resolute, to confront the truths she had long avoided. And with that choice came the certainty that nothing would ever be the same again. The days that followed Mary's quiet decision were charged with a tension she had never experienced before. Every interaction, every glance, every word spoken, or left unspoken, felt amplified. It was as though the walls of the Brown family were withholding their breath, anticipating the day that the secrets that she had harbored for so many years would finally be revealed. She remembers one afternoon in the living room, notebook on her lap, scribbling down ideas she had secretly kept for decades. Every phrase she wrote was a small act of freedom, a taking back of the voice she had forced into silence for so long. The journal was her confidant, her reflection, and her guide, a space where she could at last face the emotional complications of a life that had given so little yet asked so much. Even mundane routines started to feel altered. A passing remark, a brief look, the evasive lack of eye contact. All these now held significance, bringing to light layers of dynamics she had previously justified away. And if you imagine that she had entirely foreseen the effect of such clarity, the reality was much more disturbing. Because the further she dug, the more she saw how deeply ingrained and complex the patterns of exclusion and surveillance had become. It hadn't been malevolence that created them, but a creeping chronic imbalance that had gone on for years, conditioning the emotional map of her existence. In these quiet introspections, Meri also started to face the grief that had been piling up alongside her fidelity. She mourned the lost time, the unseeable sacrifices, the emotional labor that had been unrewarded. But at the same time, a spark of determination emerged, a sense of determination to act not in rage but from a sense of self-respect and sanity. She knew that the upcoming battles, the secrets she was about to uncover, and the decisions she would have to make were not only about her relationship with Kody, they were about taking back the story of her own life. And if you consider this as just a personal accounting, it's much more than that. Because the family, the children, the public image, all of it teetered in the balance. Every move had consequences, every step took courage, and every word uttered could change the whole dynamic she had been dancing for more than 10 years. In that frozen instant, Meri understood something fundamental. Change was coming. The world she had grown accustomed to wasn't going to last. And the decisions she would be making in the coming days wouldn't only redefine her destiny, they would upend everything the world believed about loyalty, about love, and about the price of silence. And in that still, leaden silence, she realized the truth she had never grasped. The narrative of her life was far from over. The knowledge that her life was on the threshold of change rested heavily on Meri. Living each day was like balancing on a high wire. The earth beneath her unstable with each thought, every reminiscence, and every recollection she allowed herself to recall. She realized that the moment had arrived to face not only the cycles of abandonment and rejection she had lived, but also the decisions she had made under the flag of loyalty. She remembers one evening alone in her bedroom, the gentle light of a lamp casting shadows on the walls. In the stillness, the weight of all those years of pent-up emotions settled down on her with startling lucidity. The little moments she had dismissed, the off-handed dismissals, the disregarded conversations, the silent betrayals immediately sketched out a crude map of a life half-lived. And she knew that if she continued to do so, she would lose herself completely. Each detail she had once neglected now cried out for recognition. The manner in which decisions were reached without her, the fashion in which Kody's focus was shared, the quiet emotional distance that had developed over years. All of it uncovered the unforeseen costs of a marriage she had held to unyielding dedication. And if you think that the account had already told its full burden, the truths that were to follow would be 10 times more shocking. Because this wasn't merely about lost conversations or unseen sacrifices, it was about the very fabric of a life that had silenced her voice for years. Even at these times of introspection, she was aware of the weight of the stakes. Her children, her home life, the public face of the family, everything teetered on a fragile balance. How could she find her voice once again without shattering the world she had invested so thoroughly? How could she come to terms with the reality of her own life without disintegrating the ties she still held dear? The questions were piercing, unforgiving, and impossible to avoid. And yet, in the midst of fear, a stillness came. Meri started to see that taking back herself was not simply about being vocal. It was about claiming her own worth, respecting her own feelings, and not allowing years of devotion to be received as the equivalent of silence. Each thought, each consideration, each hesitation was an advancement towards a reality she had long evaded. And if you believed that the road ahead would be easy, the truth was more complicated. Because to face all these realities would be to challenge the narrative she had lived for more than 10 years, to question the dynamics of her marriage, and to confront the unknowns of what life would be on the other side. In that tense silence, she knew one inescapable truth. The half-life of her past had been a trick, and the revelations about to break were going to stun even those who believed they knew her. Meri felt the burden of all her choices, all her compromises, weighing on her shoulders more heavily than ever. The tense silence that lived inside the home had become palpable, a reminder as constant as breath, that the way she had lived for so long was no longer maintainable. Every encounter, however inconsequential it once seemed, now bore meaning she could no longer tune out. She recalls standing in the hallway one night, observing the family circulate around her like pawns in a puzzle she had assisted in building. Each smile, each passing gaze, each chatty hello now seemed to be filled with unspoken connotations. The world she had come to understand, the one that called for patience, loyalty, and uncomplaining fortitude, was moving away from her. And if you believed that awareness was easy to face, it was anything but. Meri started seeing the habits that had always been there but that she had denied in order to keep the peace. The quiet ways in which she had been pushed aside, the constant shutdowns of her emotions, the tacit placing of others' needs before her own, they were all present, impossible to deny and impossible to shake. And with each recognition, a flame of awareness grew inside of her. She could no longer go on living as though her voice was irrelevant. Even as fear crept in, there was a peculiar freedom in the awareness that the life she knew was not absolute. She started to envision possibility where once there had been only confinement. Options she'd long shunned suddenly lay within grasp. Yet the stakes were gigantic. Each choice she considered would have an undertow effect on the family, influencing the children, the domestic dynamics, and the fragile public persona of a life she had taken pains to construct. And if you believe the tension she experienced was merely personal, it extended far beyond. For these discoveries were all interwoven with the very fabric of the family itself, the terms of a plural marriage, and the years of devotion that she had borne in silence. Every thought weighed, every thought required bravery, and each move towards progress required reconciling fear with the desire for truth. In the silence that ensued, Meri experienced an odd combination of fear and empowerment. The life that she had pretended was over, but a new one was unfolding. A new one in which her voice could finally be spoken, in which her experiences could finally be recognized, and in which the truths she had suppressed for so long could at last be confronted head-on. And in that suspended, almost breathless moment, she understood something profound. The story she had lived was only part of a much larger, far more complicated reality. And the coming days would reveal just how transformative facing that reality could be. The culmination of years of quiet struggle, reflection and resilience came crashing into Meri's awareness with a force she could no longer ignore. The home that was once a refuge now seemed like a stage upon which she'd acted out her own life in pieces, never glimpsed entirely, never heard completely. And in that, something within her changed. A spark that had burned low for years flared up into understanding and determination. She recalls one night, late at night, by the window, city lights extending beyond, she felt the entire burden of what had been happening. Every conversation she had not had, every quiet betrayal, every instance where she had presumed she could be trusted, with her loyalty just assumed, everything melted into one unmistakable fact: she could no longer live in someone else's life. Quietly in the background, the woman who had remained quiet all these years was finally heeding her own voice. Her choices were not easy. They were about the children she cherished, the family she raised, and the public image of a life that watchers had long convinced themselves they knew. But the inner monologue was simple. Silence came with a price much higher than the possibility of conflict. Every impulse, every pulse, every soft breath of bravery assured her that taking back her voice was not only necessary, it was unavoidable. And if you believe that this journey was anything less than an exploration of anger or resentment, then it was far deeper than that. It was one of self-respect, of gaining clarity from chaos, and of recognizing that love and loyalty must not be achieved at the sacrifice of one's own sense of self. All the moments of sorrow that she'd endured, all the tears that fell in secret, all the quiet sacrifices made had been building towards this realization, a realization she could no longer deny. Even with the fear that remained, there was empowerment, a sensation she had not felt in years. She knew that facing the realities of her life, hearing them aloud, and taking herself where she wanted to go, would not make the past disappear, but it would allow her to control the future. The life she had once known was changing, and for the first time, she sensed the promise of being whole. And in that held, near reverent hush, Meri realized a truth both frightening and freeing. The tale she had lived was but the start, and the world still had to catch its fullest depth. The questions that assailed her were staggering, the hurdles unceasing, and the implications far-reaching. So the question persists, hanging in the silence between our minds and hers. If you were she, would you remain? Or would you at last enter the existence that was yours to reclaim?